and welcome to episode 86 of the PowerScore LSAT podcast. I'm Dave Kaloran in sweltering Napa Valley.
This is John Dinning in slightly less sweaty Los Angeles.
Yeah, it's temperate down there in my opinion because it just can't be as hot as it is here. It's ridiculously warm.
Yeah, you're recording this from the surface of the sun, basically.
106 degrees here in Napa. A lovely day, literally, to stay inside, but I chose to go have lunch outside for the first time in a year. That was fun.
Well, first of all, I'm proud of you for just that event, but I'm even prouder of what that event commemorates. Do you want to explain?
I do, and I'll also weave in what I am drinking. So first off, I'm drinking champagne, and there's several reasons for that. The first reason is that it is actually my 10th anniversary today. And so my wife and I and our daughter went over to the restaurant, which is kind of like at a resort in Napa here, where we actually got married. So that was kind of cool. And we talked to our daughter about that. She didn't want to be there, and it was way too hot. So we struggled through it, but it was worth the time. And the other reason I'm drinking champagne is because, John, we did a crystal ball back at the end of May in which we predicted which test and two tests, actually, that we thought that LSAC would use. And on Saturday morning, we woke up to the joyful news that indeed they were using the test that we predicted.
That's right. Yeah,
and
a little bit of Christmas in June is what that was.
Christmas in June. I know I woke up feeling really good on the weekend. And interestingly enough, we'll get into that prediction a little bit more, but I'm not sure everybody listening really understands how rare it is for something like that to happen. To be able to predict it and to be accurate is really, it's only ever happened once, and I've been doing this a long time. We were the ones who did it previously, so it's happened twice, and I feel pretty good. So cheers to me. What are you drinking?
Yeah, cheers to you. To you for the anniversary, to us for the prediction.
Correct.
Cheers to me in a way, because I am finally officially, apparently COVID-proof. I've got 2+ weeks on a vaccine, my second vaccine dose. So I'm drinking one final, and I looked it up, Quarantini, celebrating the end of lockdown, full vaccination. I got to admit, I'm feeling kind of frisky. I'm ready to get out and about. So one more drink indoors, and then I'm going to hit the town.
I'm not sure our listening audience is ready for you on the loose. Is the world ready?
Yeah, I'm not sure I'm ready. I think I've probably forgotten most of it. We'll see. We'll see if I get back in the swing. But this is really just a vodka martini with a little bit of lemon, some honey, and they suggested optional vitamin C. The closest I could get was an old packet of that emergency powder. So in a bit of elaboration, I lined the rim of this martini glass with emergency and then quickly realized my mistake at a sip. So I've wiped all that off. Yeah.
Yeah, I wouldn't think that drinking that with anything would actually taste good. So
No, it was a terrible idea, and I learned my lesson.
And now you're done with it.
That's right.
And we've got an interesting song choice today. Again, feeling that kind of like historical feeling the magic, actually.
Yeah.
We've chosen Bruno Mars's 24 Karat Magic is the song, which I think is a really cool song by him. Very funky.
Yeah, it's a good sort of feel good upbeat song, which is what people hopefully are in the mood for right now with the June test behind them.
Yeah, typically if you're listening to this particular episode and you've just taken the test, you're feeling good. This is what our plan is for tonight. We're going to talk about a few things related to the LSAT and the LSAT world. Then we're going to dive into a discussion of the domestic LSAT sections and talk a little bit about the difficulty. Then we're going to talk a little bit about the international LSAT, which actually happened today. And then we're going to talk about the international LSAT scoring scale prediction and then close out with the domestic LSAT scoring scale prediction. So plenty to talk about, and given that it is my anniversary, I will say thank you once again to my wife, who laughed when I told her I was going to be doing a podcast, after the dinner hour typically would have started. So everybody's on her good grace tonight.
Oh, she's a remarkable woman. I mean, just to put up with you for 10 years is in itself quite an accomplishment. Yeah, no, that's like, she's somewhere on Rushmore of patience, but Job up there with her. But yeah, dude, give her a hug for me. That she's letting you do this tonight when we need to do it is a testament.
Yeah, everybody needs to send me a Twitter note that I can show her that says, thank you, Dave's wife. She would have a laugh about that. So, without further delay, let's get into this episode, which,
Yep.
by the way, is entitled The June 2021 LSAT-Flex Review. We make history again.
A bit of self-aggrandizement.
Oh, yeah.
But
Give me a lot of
honestly,
self-congratulation today.
this was such an amazing call on our part. I don't mind. A little backpatting.
Yeah, so we'll get to that in a moment. Let's start off and first clean up some issues that are happening in the LSAT world. The first thing is that I think longtime listeners of this podcast are aware that we have been running a stuck-at-home sale for quite a while. In fact, since the pandemic started. And we did that because, we really wanted to be cognizant of the financial situation that a lot of people were facing with the way the pandemic was affecting jobs and schools and everything like that. And I said I would run that until I felt that it was coming to an end. And Jon, both you and I are in California. California has opened up fully now. And so that sale is now coming to an end. It will run through the month of June. And then once we turn the clock to July 1st, that sale is over. That is the biggest sale we've ever run.
Yeah.
And we're never going to run anything even remotely similar. So if you're thinking about getting a course, if you're thinking about buying a book or obtaining tutoring, what have you, now is the time to do it. Because if somebody calls me on July 1st and says, I missed the sale, I'm going to be like, sorry. Door is shut. The window is closed. The AC is on. We're out.
Right. Yeah, we ran it for 15 months or so, which is, I hope you're right. The circumstances behind it, I hope we never run one like that again.
Same. Let's just hope that it really is open. And if things did change, then we'll reinstitute it if that's the case.
Sure.
But I know both you and I are hoping very, very much that doesn't happen.
Yeah, California's open as of Tuesday. So if anybody wants to come visit me, my door's now officially unlocked. Welcoming all.
Like I said, be careful about what you ask for.
That's true. But yeah, the sale ends the end of this month, so jump on it if you're looking to prep for August or beyond. Now's the time to buy something.
And we also today added a new course, a little mini course that we're kind of running into our system. We are slowly in the process of creating what will ultimately be an LSAT Bibles course. And this is something that students have been asking me about for a long time. They're like, I like the books. They're really informative, but, I'm a visual learner or I'm an auditory learner. And so one of the things that we started to do last year and has continued on through this year is we have built a course around, in this case, the Logical Reasoning Bible. Kind of expands on it. We do live demonstrations of explaining questions and things like that. And we've just added that to our website. The next podcast that we do, which will be early next week, we'll talk specifically about that course and go into more detail. We'll also have a blog article on it and additional. But if you're already one of our students, like say you have our analytics package or what have you, you can add that course. It is $19.99 a month. Will we be doing logic games and reading comprehension? Yes, we will. It takes a little bit of time because, we film these and record them and we have to show the questions and we're talking about it. But it essentially is like a video that you can see on YouTube and you can just click it anytime you want. You can watch it 1,000 times if you can stomach it. You can just skim it. You can skip parts you don't want to watch. You can kind of do it the way you want. And we'll be expanding that course as well as the others in the coming months. But that's largely what Jon and I have been working on this spring. It's also part of the reason we slowed down our podcast schedules because it's just hard to talk that much, even though you and I both like talking a lot.
Yeah. It's not hard to want to talk that much. It's hard to actually get it done.
It's hard to do it, though.
But yeah, for people who are interested in maybe experiencing the books that we have and the techniques that we present in a slightly more dynamic fashion that's very much self-guided, this course is going to be amazing. I think it's going to be a real breakthrough for a lot of people, and it's extremely affordable. We're starting with some introductory pricing of just $19.99 a month, so hopefully that doesn't break anybody's bank.
Didn't you tell me you had just rented a movie that was like $30 for a couple days?
Yeah, it's the movie that I'm embarrassed about. I was just curious, and I like Emma Stone, so I wanted to see that Cruella movie. And I didn't feel like going to a theater. I was still mid-vax.
This is why I brought it up.
I think I paid $30 to rent it.
So you're telling me that $20 for our course isn't that bad?
I would definitely take the course over Cruella.
I mean, you have like a 2-hour movie. That course is over 30 hours and will continue to grow in the future. Right. So
So, yeah, I
But
appreciate you bringing that up publicly. That's real
I
nice.
love it. It's
Yeah.
my personal pleasure to do
Real
so.
point of pride for this guy. So, thanks, buddy.
I will say this much about the way we've done this course is we've tried to keep it upbeat and very positive and lace a little bit of humor into it, maybe make it a little more fun than studying for the LSAT sometimes is. But we will talk more about that in the next podcast.
Right.
Let's add one more element from the LSAT world. This will largely benefit people who aren't done with the LSAT and who are taking the test in August. I have strong-armed Jon into doing another crystal ball for the August LSAT.
Yeah.
We haven't set the date because I just literally was like, we're doing it. And he was like, no. And I was like, yes, we're doing it. But we will do it in, say, the 2 to 3 week period, that window around there prior to the August test. And we'll probably run it the same exact way that we did this last one. We will make it free to the public for the first one, and then by agreement, we will then put it into our courses only. So this is going to be another situation where if you want to get the benefit from it, and I can tell you right now, there was massive benefit for those people who saw it in June, back in May for the June test.
Yeah.
You're going to need to want to sign up for that. So we'll announce that in the next couple of days as well, and it'll be on the next podcast too.
Yeah. To be fair, my reluctance for doing one in August, it wasn't laziness. It might have been a small part. It wasn't fear of the work. It was really that I just want us to retire on the heels of what was a perfect crystal ball in May. It's as good as it could possibly get. So I was like, let's hang it up, buddy.
I think I put a note somewhere when we were talking. I said, look, now that we've done this and predicted this correctly, we're retiring. This is it.
It was a walk-off homer, man. Like, that's when you just keep on walking right to the Hall of Fame.
No, man, I want to be like Babe Ruth and continue to point to center field and call the next home run. Let's keep on doing that.
This was us calling our shot. So, I guess we'll see if we can three-peat in August. But that is coming for anyone who's interested. And if you don't know what we're talking about with these crystal balls, definitely pay attention because, again, as you'll see, the one we just did was a game changer for a lot of people.
Yeah, we'll bring it up again when we get to the test and start talking about that.
Yeah.
But with that all covered, let's break into the June 2021 LSAT Flex, which is the very last of the Flex tests that we are going to see. So this is the end of that 3-section. It's the end of every single question that you do counting. That is a major sea change, and I'm not sure people realize just yet what that's going to mean in August, because the level of confusion in August is going to rise dramatically, because a quarter of the questions that anybody sees won't count, and it'll be very, very tough, I know from experience, to figure this out, especially with the way the online test works. So this is the end of the Flex, which is great, because every question you saw, you know that it counted. So if we talked about it and mentioned it tonight, you're like, all right, I had that counted. That was contributing to my score. First thing is this: where are we with that June test? Today was the international exam and the paper and pencil test takers. There's really only two pieces of kind of like business to take care of with it. There will be retakers next Thursday. And then the score release is going to come up on July 1st, a Thursday, at 9 a.m. Eastern Time.
Yeah, standard score release protocol applies. It won't come earlier, so don't ask. And you'll see it around 9. It might be 8:50, it might be 9:15, but give or take, you'll get the email. People by now should know the drill. That's also, and this is a bit of good timing, that's the day before the deadline to register for the August test. So you have to register for August by midnight, 11:59 Eastern on the 2nd of July, which is a Friday night. That's also the deadline to submit any accommodation requests and other paperwork that you need. So keep that in mind. The clock is ticking.
That's exactly right. But at least we have that one-day window where you have your score back. If you have score preview, you get your score back on the same day as everybody else. You just then have like 5-6 days to actually figure it out.
Cancel it if you want.
Yeah.
But yeah, at least people don't have to sign up for August blind. They'll know what they did in June if they took June. And presumably anyone listening to this did.
Okay. Let's move on and talk a little bit about what we saw during the test week.
Sure.
I'll cover the days and a little bit of the numbers that we saw, and then you can kind of place that historically for us.
Fun.
So we started off on Saturday morning, had about 8,000 test takers run through Saturday. This turned out to be the biggest day.
Yeah.
Then on Sunday, you had a little bit smaller of a group, about 6,500. Monday, no testing. Always my favorite day, even though it's Monday.
Yeah.
Then on Tuesday, we come back a little bit picked up here. We had 7,100 test takers. And then finally, Thursday, which is the day that we're recording this, you only had about 1,300. And that's because these groups, the international test takers, not that many of them, relatively speaking, and then paper and pencil accommodated test takers, also a very low number. So about 1,300 total. All in all, that's just under 23,000 test takers here that we're able to kind of work through everything. How does that stack up in terms of like where we thought we were going to be with the numbers?
Well, it's interesting you bring that up because the way this test looked during the registration period for it was that it was going to set all kinds of records. It was looking to be enormous, well into the 30,000 plus kind of numbers. And what we've seen even really over the last 8 to 10 days is just a steady decline, an attrition of registrants, people who actually intended to take the test. So as of like last Tuesday, for instance, there were about 29,500. As of today, it was down to 25,900 or so. So you can see just in the last week plus, we lost about 4,000 people. And
Exactly.
apparently, from what we've seen so far, there were another 2,000 to 3,000 who didn't test, even though they were still registered as of today. Where that stacks up historically, again, we thought this was going to be the biggest flex test. Turns out it's about the third biggest flex test. It'll be, I think, probably the third biggest test in the last couple of years. But a bit of trivia that I'm sure you already know, Dave. When people try to put these numbers into some historical context, the largest test that I'm aware of, certainly the largest recent test on record, is all the way back in those banner years in the late 2000s, in the early 2010s, the aughts, I guess. October 2009 was an enormous test. 60,746 tests were administered back in that October exam. So you think about how
That's
many we're
numbers.
seeing now in the low 20s, mid 20s, even pushing 30. That's half as many as took it back in the heyday, the golden era of LSAT in the late 2000s.
Yeah, where they could have, one proctor for 200 people.
Yeah, that helped. Jam a bunch
Yeah.
of cattle in a room and just sling paper at them.
That's pretty much how it used to be. Just massive, halls at schools like UCLA and what have you, just filled with people.
Yeah.
Lots of shuffling noises and what have you. Totally different experience now. But also, the test was only administered 4 times a year at that point. And so that was the concentration of a whole year's worth of test takers just spread out over 4 exams. Now we have more than double than that. And so it automatically makes each administration a bit smaller.
Yeah. Although, again, for a June test, this was still a whopper. For perspective, last June and July, 2 of the earliest flex tests, together only totaled 22,500 or so people. So June and July of last year together were still smaller than what we've seen so far this week.
Well, let's continue on
All
because
right.
that means there's a lot of people who are like, yeah, get to the prediction. Let's, before we get there, remind everybody that with LSAT Writing, if you have not taken it at some point in the past, you will not get your score. All right. We do this every time, and I always get calls afterwards that says, my score hasn't shown up. And the reason is you have to have an LSAT writing result on record. Now, if you did it last year, that's fine. You just need one. That is a necessary condition to getting your score. There are typically thousands of people at each administration who have yet to take the LSAT writing. If you go out and take it now, in the next several days, you'll be fine. They've gotten it down. It's pretty efficient. We've already talked about all the rules that relate to that. John, you want to quickly hit those?
Yeah, it's the standard stuff, basically. You just don't want to do anything that could potentially get your test or your writing sample flagged, such as show both sides of your scratch paper at the end and beginning. Don't wear any kind of smartwatch or digital jewelry. Clear photo of yourself and your ID when you first log in and register, because again, there's no live proctor to walk you through this. It's all automated, so you have to do the steps correctly. And then, again, fairly obvious, but just to say it, don't have a cell phone either on you or visible. Don't have anything in the background that could, again, be cause for alarm or confusion, like a backpack or some noteboard or something on your wall that has writing on it. Sterilize the room, follow all the steps, do everything right, and they'll process this very quickly for you, and you'll be fine.
All right. Let's continue on and start talking a little bit about, we'll come back to the August LSAT, I think, at the end.
Okay.
And kind of like fit that into this a little bit.
Sure.
Let's talk a little bit about some of the problems that we saw and that we always see. There's always going to be basic issues. And I always say the same thing is that no matter how the administration goes, everybody falls into really two different camps. It really went well or there were problems. And when there are problems, it's always bad because it affects you. Even if it's just like you lost 10 seconds, it's upsetting. And so we understand that. So when we talk about the nature of the administration, we're talking about in general. For each individual, that experience can really vary. And I would say that LSAC has gotten better and better as this has gone on. When we compare it to the very first flex tests and all the different problems that we had there, the major issues are largely ironed out. This was an administration where the information I was receiving from LSAC and what I was getting back from students was remarkably low key. There weren't that many issues. Now, if you were a person who had an issue, I completely understand. It is utterly damaging and distressing. So I'm not making light of that. I'm talking about the collective here. This is much better than it used to be. However, we still did see some of the same issues. The Macintosh operating system issues are out there. Issues with proctors intervening during the test and saying, oh, I can't see your scratch paper, which is kind of a newer one to me.
Yeah, or stop looking off camera for whatever reason. People, kind of just look off into space and think. Proctors were cutting in to tell people to stop.
Yeah, keep your face pointed towards the camera. I'm like, look, I'm not a robot, man. I like to think and look around.
Yeah.
So there was that. I didn't, sometimes they ask you to move your desk around so it's facing a certain way, or the doors behind you, that kind of thing. We saw all of those. We also saw the usual thing where a proctor might not be 100% knowledgeable about whether you could use a highlighter or pens or earplugs. Remember, walk into these tests forearmed with the knowledge of what is allowed. You can have all those things.
Right.
You're allowed to use that. If a proctor starts to interrupt you, immediately ask that they pause the test. They have the power to do that. So if somebody's fooling around with your mouse from afar, and that's kind of what it feels like. It's like someone's taking over. Don't just look at it and be like, stop, what are you doing? Be like, pause the section now. Command it.
Yeah.
Be a lawyer. It's your own courtroom, essentially. You need to be counsel for yourself and defend your rights in these situations. You do that, and all of a sudden you can relax. You're like, yeah, if you want to fool around with the mouse for 2 minutes, I'll just take a breather.
Yeah, let me interject and go one further with that. The advice that I've been giving to people is don't wait until something happens to have that conversation. Be proactive. At the beginning of your test, when you're checking in and dealing with the proctor, outline some of your basic rights and expectations at the outset. Tell them, be like, listen, if you need to do anything or suggest anything, if I'm doing something wrong or you have a question, pause this time, please, because you're not going to be able to reset it and I don't want to lose it. And then we can talk and I'll do whatever you tell me to. As long as you get this stuff laid out ahead of time, proctors tend to abide by it, but sometimes they just don't know. And frankly, that's a dangerous circumstance to operate under.
Yeah, and if they don't know, or if they change proctors, as does happen with a lot of people, at least know what your rights are and be forceful.
Yeah.
Sometimes people are worried that they're going to offend the proctor. So what? The proctor is offending you when these things happen. You're the one who's actually paid to take the test. It is your right to have the best possible experience. This isn't being mean. This is simply kind of like being reasonable in the negotiation. Hey, can you go ahead and pause the timer? Awesome. Now, what is it? What do you need from me? I can help. Yes, it's disruptive. We know that it breaks your train of thought, throws you out of rhythm. But it's a lot easier to have that conversation than get back into things when you know that you weren't penalized by lost time.
Yeah.
Because nobody deserves to lose 60 seconds, 120 seconds, what have you on this test. Every second counts, in my opinion. So we will always preach this. We always will preach this as long as this test is administered this way.
Yeah.
You're dealing with people, not robots, and that allows you to talk to them. So exercise that right when you need to.
Yeah, it's a great point. As I've explained to people, as much as I never want to advocate for that old maxim about like the customer's always right, because clearly few things are as false as that. But in this case, you're the customer and you do have a tremendous amount of rights and privileges, and you have certain expectations that should be met. Exercise that.
100%.
Insist upon it. Yeah.
Now, if you really do have a catastrophic problem, if you can't test or power goes out and you can't get back into the exam, or you lose 20 minutes in a section. If it is catastrophic, there is the option in many cases to have a retake the following week. The retake for this exam, I believe, is set for Thursday, June 24th. Just keep this in mind, though. You get, a 30-second or a 90-second disruption, you're not going to get the retake. It has to be catastrophic, where the entire fundamental nature of your experience is compromised or simply eliminated. So don't go into the test thinking, okay, if I don't like the situation, I'll get myself a retake. That's not how they do it. They look at your session and they examine it very carefully. And use that complaint form in your LSAC file. Whereas, you want to talk about the test, that is the easiest way to get them aware of the situation, especially if you've had something bad happen. And I talked to a few students this weekend who had, and in each case, it was bad enough that they did get the retake. So usually if people are reaching out to me to tell me about a problem, it was bad.
Yeah.
But it wasn't... in the first days of the kind of the Flex format, I was getting those messages constantly. I only got a few of them this time, so it's getting better.
Yeah, for sure. I know that's little consolation to anyone who did have an issue, as you say, but it should be at least some consolation to people planning a test in the future, because it means, again, that we're trending in the right direction and that most things tend to be worked out by now. And the fact that there's that safety net of a makeup is a great comfort as well.
Yeah, I'd have to agree with that. So here we go. We're going to get into the testing at this point. And as always, we will begin with a series of disclaimers.
My favorite.
That's funny. I was just going to say my favorite part. We do this all the time simply because if we don't, then, it's just not clear to people what's actually happening. All right, so the first one is this. I see this on every test day. Your section order doesn't mean anything in terms of trying to figure out what test you had. A lot of times someone will say, I had reading comp, then games, then LR, and someone will say, I had the same test. That doesn't mean anything.
Yeah.
You can have the same order and have completely different tests. Throughout each LSAT Flex, and this will continue into August and later on when the Flex format ceases to exist, they use multiple versions of the test. There are going to be multiple reading comp sections. So you might get one, I might get a different one. Same thing with games. And there's even more logical reasoning sections. This leads to a number of combinations. So as you kind of go through this, you're not going to hear us talk about the order of the sections. We don't care. LSAC says that it is simply randomized. And yeah, I don't want reading comprehension last because I want to get it out of the way first. And maybe someone else is the reverse. Whatever happens to us is what happens. That's just luck of the draw. They don't worry about that. They just worry about the section difficulty. So we're not going to talk about that, but you should be aware of it.
Right.
The other thing is that we are going to talk about general topics here. We're going to talk about what the passage was about, maybe a few relevant comments about difficulty. We're going to focus solely on topics, though. We're not going to talk about specific identifying features. We're not going to talk about how to diagram the rules. We're not even going to talk about the rules. We're not going to talk about what the correct answer choice was to that, viciously difficult Newton logical reasoning question. So it's done that way in order to be fair to everybody and to also respect LSAC's copyrights. They have allowed us and students after the test to have general discussions because they know people are people. That's what we're going to use. Now, question is when we get to the predictions, we'll talk about how we use that information as well as everything else to make the predictions. But with that in mind, let's go through these kind of domestic LSATs.
Yeah.
And John, I know you have your own disclaimer that you like to make.
Oh, do I? What is it? Remind me. I thought you just covered pretty much everything I could think of. What is it?
It is built around the idea that almost everybody who takes this test comes out feeling worse about it than they ever have felt about any practice test.
Gotcha. I actually had two, and I wasn't sure which you were referring to. I didn't want to jump the gun on the wrong one. But yeah, there's this weird, almost negativity bias that everyone has. About 20 minutes before you and I jumped in here to do this, I talked to a student who took the paper and pencil test today, and she was telling me a little bit about hers. And you could just feel the despair in her voice as she thought back. She's like, oh, God, I wonder if I missed that. Oh, no, I bet I got that one wrong. And I was like, just first of all, calm down. You're in the basically the afterthrows of battle here. You're never going to feel great. This is exhausting and taxing. But secondly, people's memories are notoriously flawed and faulty and deceptive. So I always tell people when they come out of the test, chances are good that you feel worse about it than you did. However, again, the recall effect is never going to be one that operates in your favor, or at least very rarely would it. So take it with a grain of salt, however you're feeling. The other disclaimer, and this is what I thought you might be getting at, is that when we do get into these scale predictions, we tend to be fairly conservative with our estimates.
I was waiting on that one for
That-
when
Okay.
we get to it.
I just didn't know how premature I was about to be in saying that.
As ever, quite premature.
Aye.
All right, so let's get into this. Saturday morning, I wake up relatively early, as I always do on LSAT day, interested in knowing, could we be right about having predicted that the February 18 LSAT, an LSAT that was given and non-disclosed, and that we predicted back in our crystal ball, could it actually be reused? I was very eager for this, Jon, and within seconds, I saw what was being talked about in reading comprehension, and I was like, yes, we have nailed it. And this is the comment. I know some people out there are like, geez, these guys are being self-complimentary. Yeah, today I will be self-complimentary. Usually I'm really chill about this stuff. I don't know if anybody really can appreciate the magnitude of us being able to predict the test from the many forms there are out there that they would reuse. It's just not something that really... I don't think anyone else is capable of doing it. Nobody else has the information that we have on prior uses and the questions and so forth. So I think we're the only ones that could do it.
Yeah.
And we very rarely go into it in detail. We did the crystal ball back in May, and I felt very strongly, and you agreed with me after we looked at everything together, that the number of options that they had for this test was really narrow. And given that scenario, we're like, we came out pretty strong and said we feel very strongly these are the tests to look at. This was one of the tests.
Yeah.
And so, again, I will start this whole discussion by saying, Jon, well done.
You as well, my friend. In fact, here's my real question for you. It's a bit personal. What's the greater moment of glory for you? Having predicted this test exactly, or convincing your wife to stay for a decade? Because I'm honestly not sure what you're going to say. I think I know. And this was a really good prediction, you're right.
Clearly the wife,
Oh.
That's the greater achievement. That's 10 years.
Yeah.
I don't think I'm that tough to live with, to be honest with you. But
pretty easy.
You never know.
No, you're usually after talking to me. So I think that's probably that bought you at least 4 years, I think.
Yeah. Either way, it is... And this is also echoes an LSAT question for some of you. It is an historic feat to me to have been able to do this, and I am super happy. I mean, over the moon, literally, about being able to do this. Because our job, Jon, is to try to help people to do better on this test. And for us to make a prediction like that, one of the things that we really said was key was, look, the test that we think they're going to reuse is really normal. If you start seeing some of these topics, you can relax and say, this is a decent test. It's a fair test. There's no weirdness on this test. And I had multiple people say to me, man, I felt relaxed when I realized that's what it was. He's like, can't believe that. It made me feel so good. And I'm like, this is why I always say to, if you're not taking Power Score, you're not really on the cutting edge of, LSAT preparation. What we do is, in my opinion, eons past what anyone else is able to do with this. No one else will even talk about it because they don't have the background. So, yeah, I probably could just, spout off about this all night. I'm really hyped up about it.
Well, I mean, I think you're hyped up less for the personal achievement it represents, although let's not undersell it. But
I don't care about that.
Yeah, more so for the fact of what this actually meant for students who were paying attention to us, paying attention to what we advised, and then walked in and were really rewarded for the attentiveness, for the awareness that they had. Look, everyone in this industry, in this business, to some degree operates on a desire for clairvoyance. It's what we do. When we tell people this is what you should expect if you see this type of flaw, or this is how they phrase this answer choice. If you see this wording in a conditional statement, here's how you set it up. All that's really done with a prediction in mind. You are likely to see this. If you do, here's how you react. This was just taking it one step further. So, I mean, this wasn't far afield from what we typically do. It was just at the absolute cutting edge of what we typically do, the
We
bleeding
got very
edge.
specific about it
Yeah.
and explained why. That was the beauty of it to me. I
Right.
don't care about the personal accolades. I mean, I like them, but I love the fact that I had students who were like, that helped.
That
I'm like,
helped.
that's why we do this. So, February 2018, the logic game section. Let's go through it. 23 questions in this section. It's pretty fair. It starts off with 2 games that I think are very reasonable. There's one about 5 students in a seating arrangement and assignments. Students coming to the U.S., I believe. That's not a bad game. In fact, a lot of people don't even remember it because it just goes so quickly.
Mm-hmm.
The second game is about 5 different classes. This is kind of like management in upper lecture halls and lower lecture halls. At least one of the classes is about management. That's
Right.
also a reasonable game for most people. Then the difficulty goes up a little bit in the third and fourth games. The third is kind of like this unusual game about a museum burglary and noises and guards investigating it.
Right.
It's got a little bit of unusual elementation to it, but there is a way to solve that game where it's maybe less difficult than it might feel.
Yeah.
And then the last game, I think for a lot of people, it's also because the third game challenges them a little bit. They get to the fourth game, it's about econ classes and prerequisites, and that the prerequisite kind of scenario really throws people off a little bit. And I feel like that is the harder of the last 2 games and the hardest game of that test. And again, individual results may vary, but that was the logic game section from February of 2018. Now, somebody might say, and they always do after this, where can I go see that test? You cannot. All these tests that are being reused were non-disclosed. February used to be the administration every year that they did not disclose. So we knew what they gave on the test, but we didn't see those particular questions come out into the public thereafter. So you can't. Now they've reused it because nobody has seen it before. But this is a fair section. If you're thinking, man, this was a terribly difficult section, I understand why. The third and fourth games were not easy. But remember, the first 2 weren't terrible. And we're talking about balancing the section.
Right.
And this is a fairly balanced section. John, then we had the reading comp from that test. What was on that?
Yeah, another, I'd say, fairly normal section, a little tricky, as we'll discuss. The first passage there was about Elaine Locke and W.B. Du Bois, about African-American adult education. So perhaps a little bit of diversity, a little bit of humanities in that. The second passage, this is the one I think I would probably like most, although again, that's a very relative statement, was about beetle larvae protecting cottonwood trees' defensive mechanisms with ants after beavers chopped them down, gnawed them down. The third passage was about, I believe her name was Cecilia Bach, in Lying and Democracy. And then it ended with the comparative passage, arguments for and against lengthening the copyright laws on books. This had to do with parliamentary copyright laws. So fairly standard section in terms of topics, no tricky science, a lot of humanities, some law, normal.
Not an easy
But
section
not an
overall,
easy
especially
section, no.
Yeah, the last passage really bothered a lot of people. And I'm going to highlight some things right now that are going to reoccur here. Notice that Elaine Locke shows up in that first passage. This isn't the only appearance of Locke that we're going to see in our discussion tonight. Then you see this beetle larvae in the kind of like in the tree one that we're talking about second. Again, insects.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to see a lot of common topics, and I'll make a little bit more mention of it when we run into it again. But this section, one of the things that we had said to people about it beforehand is this is really standard. There's a law passage. There's a science passage. We're not saying it's easy. We're just saying it's fair and that the topics in the presentation are exactly what you expect. Some humanities, science, law. And that's really kind of comforting to know that, hey, this is the type of section that I should expect to see. It's normal. This is why the prediction that we made and the discussion that we had prior to this test in the crystal ball is so important. All right, so that's...
Speaking of comfort, again, these were things that anyone who attended the crystal ball was like, oh yeah, Elaine Locke. Thought so. Nice.
Now we get to some logical reasoning.
Mm-hmm. And both sections from February 2018 appeared right away Saturday morning. From what I could tell, I don't think there was any particular order to the rollout of these.
Yeah.
Both sections had 25 questions. Dave, you want LR1 or 2?
I will take LR1.
Go for it.
So 25 questions in here. Here's some of the topics that we actually saw in those questions. Adults with dealing with like vitamin B6. I just call this the vitamin B6 question. A folk medicine comparison versus modern drugs. A rabies outbreak in 1900s Europe leads to tales of vampires, which is a question that I really, really want to see.
I do too. I'm bummed I can't read that one.
Something about rehabilitation and workout shoes. Questions about like foreshocks and major earthquakes. Cyclists using banned drugs, and it goes on and on. Ivy growing on the side of a building. Family staying at a motel has a bad experience. Another question I totally want to read.
Yeah.
and actually get a chance to see. But this was what we call the first of the two logical reasoning sections, and I saw this one instantaneously that morning coming out. What was on the other logical reasoning section that was used from February 2018?
Sure. Yeah. Another one with 25 questions appeared more or less side by side, as I said. One of the questions that got talked about a lot early was about E.T., like the movie. There was one about brown bats and white noise disease. Again, not the only bat question that we'll run into. There was one about Japanese bells from the 11th and 12th centuries. Employee email spies, seems interesting. Genetic altruism was in that section. One about leisure time that a lot of people talked about. So, again, a wide variety of topics, and as we will see going forward, some overlapping things with other test sections as well.
Yeah, that became a really big theme,
Yes,
is sorting out all the duplication. And it also caused a lot of confusion. I could see people talking online and like, oh, I had that Shakespeare. And I'm like, you didn't have the same question. I would really like to do a live commentary of like all the information as we see it. Because we come in with a big advantage because we already have all these topics beforehand. Like this entire February 2018 test, I think I know every question on it, at least by topic. So after that test was used for a while on Saturday, a little bit later on in the day, we began seeing a new reading comprehension section.
Right.
And this reading comprehension section had not, to our knowledge, appeared as an entire section. In fact, they have pieced it together, and that's exactly why you have experimental sections, so you can piece it together. And I'll give you a great example of how that works. The very first passage on this new section was about a woman, her name was Vera Brittain, who became a pacifist after World War I. The very first time that I saw this passage appear was back in February of 2012. It was an experimental section in the reading comprehension at that point, and then it appeared again 5 years later in September 2017 as an experimental. So they tested this a few times before finally saying it's ready for showtime and putting it out there. But this is why I feel like we have such an advantage, because I can go back and be like, yeah, I know what they did in February of 2012 with their experimental reading comprehension sections. So when this pops up, it's not like a mystery to us as to what the nature of the passage is. Mm-hmm. The next passage was about the Inuits in Canada. And then the third passage was probably the hardest on this section, and I've heard a lot of complaints about this. Kind of like court's legal interpretation of adding new principles, byproduct versus enrichment. Heard this was confusing, heard it was dense, heard it was the hardest of the four. And of course, since it sat third, it made the fourth passage feel tough as well, which was the comparative, which involved things like keystone predators, which is what we're going to end up calling it. It had something to do with starfish and grasshoppers as well. Probably a passage, John, I think that you would enjoy reading.
Yeah, I know enough about that one that I feel pretty comfortable already. I heard keystone predators, and I was like, what do you want to know? But apparently, no one was actually asking. But yeah, it was about predation of keystone species and how it affects prey behavior with population shifts.
Yeah. And those, again, this is where you see a lot of LSAT sections. The first two passages aren't terrible.
Right.
And then the last two are harder. And it makes the whole section feel bad. And so just be aware of that when you're looking at it. And, you know, as we talk about this difficulty, I'll add another one of our disclaimers. Every section on the LSAT is hard to me. I think they're all difficult. I don't think there is such a thing as an easy section. There are easier sections. By comparison, they're still difficult, but they're on the easier side of it. So if you hear us say something like that's an easy passage, we just mean that relatively speaking. We're not saying in an absolute sense, oh man, that was cake. I don't think high school kids would come in here and do well on this test. So it's not an easy test. This is all relative. We're all talking about difficulty on this.
Yeah, I'll bite my tongue on that last. But there's a parallel between the way that the construction of the RC in the afternoon there, to me, really mirrored the games from that morning, where you started off fairly light, 2 simple games, simple relative. And then it really escalated towards the end, and it colors people's perspective of the entire experience, when in fact, it's far more piecemeal in terms of the placement of difficulty.
Yeah, and you see again some kind of like insects floating around. So sometimes
Yeah.
people were like, "Oh, it was insects." I'm like, "Which ones?" You know, there are these elements of commonality that keeps coming up. And as bad as it is at times in reading comprehension, I'd say it's far worse in logical reasoning.
Yeah, I mean, there's
So,
50 plus instances per test to actually overlap things, and they love to.
yeah, because of the appearance of Vera Brittain, this is a section that we could just kind of like in a shorthand way are calling the September 17 experimental.
Yeah.
It's kind of what it feels like to us. So then we got some new logical reasoning that kind of came in on Saturday a little bit later in the day. And this was a really tough section because this is also a new section that is floating around out there. It doesn't have a really obvious predecessor point where you're like, oh, they gave that on this particular test or it was experimental here. So let me just cover some of that.
Yeah.
Some of this. And this was, I will say, by all reports, a harder section to deal with. There was a question about African elephants, and I think hyenas were in there.
Mhm.
There was a question about grapefruits and them being harmful for consumption. There was a question about criticizing Newton's theories and the female scientist, Emily du Châtelet, who was criticizing Newton. That was a tough question. Question about monkeys fighting, another one about muscle contractions, and then calcium supplements, which might have had something to do with milk. I'm not totally sure there. There was questions about feathered dinosaurs and workplace productivity, dolphins and sharks, business school and ethics class. We can go on and on. But I'll point something out to you. You're starting to see some topics that we are seeing and we're going to see elsewhere. Shakespeare. So if you're like, oh, I had the Shakespeare question, but I don't recognize any of that other stuff, you probably had the other section that had Shakespeare. How about, a question about fruit?
Yeah.
Grapefruit, and then fruits in another section. Questions about dinosaurs, questions about milk were duplicated. And every time I see this happen, I'm like, boy, they must be laughing it up in Pennsylvania where they're like, try to figure this out. We're going to give you 2 passages that involve a lane lock or lock itself. We're going to give you 2 different logical reasonings that involve Shakespeare. This one is the Shakespeare Hamlet question. So if you're like, wait, I didn't have Hamlet, I had one about a sonnet, you had the other section.
Yeah.
That's how tough this is. And this is when we know every question is real.
Right. Yeah,
brutal.
Imagine what's going to happen in August when we have the whole quarter of it doesn't count and gets really, really tricky to track. We see this every time, which makes me think it has to be intentional. We saw it back in April, I think, with the dinosaur raptor claw, multiple questions. We've seen it before with Einstein being used twice. So they're just jerks, basically. They're trying to make our lives difficult.
They don't see it that way.
No, I know.
In the same way that it's our job to predict what we think is going to happen on the test and to help prepare people by focusing on the things that will appear the most, it's their job to confuse and obfuscate and to retreat, withdraw, and attack. This is their job. This is the battle that we have. It's a good battle. And, it's a fair fight right now, at least on our level.
It seems to be pretty evenly matched so far.
Yeah.
Everybody's always looking to build a better mousetrap, but so far, I like our odds. We'll see if I feel the same way in August.
Well, no one else wants to step into the arena and try to do this, and I can understand why. But this logical reasoning section that involves the Hamlet Shakespeare question, this is going to have an effect. This was a hard section, and it's always difficult to assess logical reasoning. But I think as we get down into the matrix in a few minutes, we'll see that this actually helps people out a little bit.
Yeah.
All right, so then we continue on, and one of the things that you and I were looking for on Sunday was, would we see a new logic game section? And it's always hard to tell if they've added it late Saturday or early Sunday. But indeed, we saw a new section, and in the same vein of what we were seeing before, this did not come from a specific pretest. This wasn't like a February 2018 reuse. This was a section of logic games that pretty much everybody else had. There were only 2 logic game sections on this test. So either you had that first one, which had like the museum burglary, etc., and the econ prerequisites, or you had this section. And this section started off with recordings being made over 4 days.
Mhm.
Then it was 7 students into 3 study groups, a couple different positions as well. And then there was truck loading bays and a bunch of trucks going into 3 different bays, which was notable because it was the northwest and south. And this is interesting because this game, we saw this on the February 2018 LSAT as an experimental.
Yeah.
So they used the test, and then they use experimentals from the test. I'm like, man, they're really mining that Feb 2018.
Yeah, that's
vein.
5 games off that test minimum that they somehow found a way to use. 4 that were real on Saturday, and then 1 from the experimental at least starting Sunday. They milked that test for all it was worth.
Yeah, and then they pulled out a game to end it out about volunteers into positions within these 2 committees, zoning and
Right.
voting, and then they have like a president, secretary, treasurer position. That's a game that we first saw in December of 2017 as an experimental game. So this section I felt was very reasonable, easily remembered as the one with like the truck loading bays that's floating around there. I don't think this was a section that was unreasonable or unbalanced. I think this was a very fair section overall. I know that truck game with the 3 directions was a little bit odd, but I don't think most people were like, if you're going to have this in the casino and this comes up, I think a lot of people are like, all right, I can accept that as my result.
Yeah, I didn't seem to think this was too bad. Most people, I think, felt okay about it. Nobody ever loves what they see, but this definitely wasn't too brutal. And then we got into what I believe was the final section for the main North American administrations this week. There was one final logical reasoning set of questions that came up. 26 questions, and here were some of them. And again, if some of these sound familiar, imagine how we feel. There was a question on there about a dinosaur fossil, Chinese dinosaur fossil, and the ability to glide. This was not the same one, apparently, as the Chinese the feathered dinosaur fossil from the prior section. This one had to do with forearm bones. There was one about milk being bad from humans, but not the same as the question from before. There was one about low and high sodium and salt diets. One of the questions that got talked about the most, I think because most people had never heard this before, was about crazed glass, windows, and fire and arson, where apparently if you heat up a window and then cool it down really quickly, the glass can fracture and shatter in a very like spiderwebby type of way. Crazed glass is what that's called. There was a fruit question about smokers eating fruits and vegetables, not grapefruit, but just fruits and vegetables, and getting cancer more often, apparently. Here comes Shakespeare number 2. This was Shakespeare and another writer, I think it might have been Davies, in contention that there's authorship on some famous mystery sonnet, I believe is how that went. Another question about bats. In this case, it was about protecting bats. And I'm not just cherry picking all the overlap. These are just literally the way that these questions were given to us. Companies acting unethically, historic buildings in a city, the age of buildings in a city, art and how people make imitation art and fakes that should be considered real, because the real artist apparently had some help along the way. Jelly beans in a jar, kind of want to see that one. Guessing the number. Stealing wood from national parks. I'll stop there, but that was the last section of logical reasoning that we've seen this week.
So if you're counting and you had the domestic LSAT, you had 1 of 2 logic games, 1 of 2 reading comprehension, and 1 of 4 logical reasoning. That's 16 total outcomes. Isn't it really interesting to me because that's way down from what we've seen?
Yep.
Now, if you're like, look, I took the test, in the US on Saturday or Sunday and I didn't have that. Remember, sometimes they opt people out of certain sections and forms because you might have seen it before. So if you had something different, that is possible. It's this is mostly everybody would fall into these groups, but just be aware that sometimes due to the way they do testing protocols, they may have given you a one-off test that very few other people actually had, so we're not going to cover it. But that's only 16. We've seen administrations before that had 54 different combinations.
Yeah.
And you and I had talked about like, geez, do they need to have that many sections? No, we didn't think that they did. And I feel like they realized that they didn't. So they used fewer. Which made it easier.
Yeah.
Still difficult to take the test, but it makes it easier to understand kind of like in the aftermath.
Yeah, I don't know if that qualifies so much as a prediction from us or just advice that they followed.
Yeah, not a prediction
Perhaps,
to me.
yeah, perhaps a bit of both. We were saying that, look, they don't need to keep this up. I don't know why they would. We doubt they will. 3 games, 3 reading comp, and 6 LR sections for a single week is just overkill. So I'm glad to see them dialing this back down a little bit.
Yeah, that's not a prediction. It was definitely advice. We'll send the bill.
Yeah. Don't hold your breath.
But notice also you can do this with 16 because with this amount of overlap between topics, it's inherently confusing. And this is one of the reasons why I don't have a problem with people talking about section topics, because I'm like, if you get any gain from it, trust me, you're also taking a negative during the test week trying to figure this out.
Yeah.
It's just inherently confusing to juggle this information. You're far better walking in on test day and not thinking about what you might see and focusing on what you in fact do see.
Yeah, and there's this false narrative that goes along with the fewer sections of the test floating around, the easier it is to cheat, or the easier it is to gather information about what you're likely to see. And the truth of the matter is, with 16 of these, many of which are hard to distinguish, even with some scrutiny, there's really no chance that someone could gain some kind of meaningful advantage by knowing this stuff in advance.
Yeah. So that took us through Saturday, Sunday, and Tuesday. Today we had the international test, which appeared to be largely a single use of a prior test. This was the test they used today was the December 2016 European LSAT.
Yeah.
Again, all international tests are non-disclosed, so this was used previously. We've seen it a couple times before. It's bounced around. This is not the first reuse of this. So when I saw this today, I was like, ooh, I know that one. Let's run through this quickly, and then we will get into the scaling predictions for all of this.
Mm-hmm.
So the logic game's 23 questions. Starts off with a game about 5 witnesses being selected out of a group of 7. Then there's the floors of a gallery or a museum. Notice again, here we have like a gallery museum type of thing, like just in the other section, with different types of medium like sculpture and painting in terms of what's being displayed. Then there's the third game, which I think is probably the toughest. It's about academic scholarships in humanities, math, or sciences. And then finally, an assignment of journalists and reporters to sections of a newspaper like Metro, Life, and the national section. This is, a fair section. It's tough in that third game, and I know that fourth game's a little bit tricky. But again, I don't think it's unreasonable. I'll do the reading comp, and then I'll let you do the logical reasoning.
Oh, wonderful.
Let you. I don't know why
Hooray.
I said that. You can do it. You want to do reading comp instead?
No, I really, you'd be amazed at how little preference I have.
So here's your international reading comprehension. Starts off with a comparative from about the UN Declaration on Human Rights. Then we talk about silkworms. So again, insects. This time it's about Colombia and coffee making. So again, distinct, but we're talking insects. Then here we go with another lock passage. This, Locke didn't want to be called a subjectivist, but thought emotions were important, talking about value theory. That's a hard passage. Anything that deals with Elaine Locke is typically hard. And then finally, another hard passage, although maybe only because it followed a difficult one. That was about the evolution of bipedalism in hominids. So not an easy section either. And now we get to the 2 logical reasoning. I really only saw one of these in use, but we'll cover both of them because the chances are likely that they use both of them.
Oh, that's me now. Sorry.
Yes. Yeah, if you want me to just keep rolling,
No, I've just gotten so comfortable. I was just kind of listening to you and luxuriating in it all and my lack of responsibilities. Again, this December 2016 Euro test had 2 logical reasonings. I think, again, you and I have only spotted one so far for the internationals, but that's not to say we didn't miss something. So let's do them both. The first one that we'll talk about, the 26th question, LR. Early question about rats and pellets. There was a disagreement between people about a science fiction novel. There was a question about lakes and rivers on Mars and a comparison between the likelihood of each. There was one about thread and polyester count. Or content rather, polyester, silk, cotton, things like that. There was one about apprentice versus skilled workers, and even one about, towards the end, I think some people may not have gotten to this, but a frog disappearing is how I heard that question described. But
cool.
Yeah, an interesting section, a good mix of things. And then the other section of LR from December 2016 Euro had 25 questions and started early, I believe, with a question about squirrels covering body in rattlesnake venom, probably some like anti-predator behavior.
I need to see that question too.
I know, I do want to see that question. Geese migrating in a V formation, aloe vera and cosmetic products. Here's another one I think I'd like because I'm confused about the relationship. T-Rex fossils and turbinates in sinuses. No idea. A grad student thesis on Kant, question about BMI, body mass index, question on Aristotle, rockets and space travel, seatbelts and drunk driving laws. I'll stop there. But two very distinctive sections, neither of which I think was easy. But nothing that has happened on this December 2016 Euro test struck me as outrageously hard or weird, which are typically the two words that I'm hoping don't come up.
Yeah, and I think it's, again, a fair test. There's some challenging elements in both the logic games and the reading comprehension. Now, no matter which reading logical reasoning that you had, it's not going to make a difference. Let's just do the matrix for this test right here and be done with that, since it's a little bit easier.
Before we do let me clarify one thing. When I said there was nothing outrageously hard or weird on this test, that's not to say this was not a hard test. I still think this one probably falls to the harder side of average. So
what you're saying is there wasn't a computer virus game on here.
Yeah, nobody had to do a circle or a pattern. There wasn't a passage that was about some extremely dense scientific idea, some astrophysics thing that most people never even heard of. None of that occurred. The LR wasn't, again, sort of strange in its frequency of question types. Like, oh my God, I had to do 7 parallel questions. What happened? It was nothing like that.
Exactly. So let's get into the matrix. First, we'll do the international matrix, and then we'll do the domestic U.S. matrix. And let's explain how this works. Mm-hmm. When we look at scores, we try to predict how many questions you can miss to obtain a 170 LSAT score. So to do this, we start at a baseline of saying on the average test or so, you can miss 7. It's not really at the average test, but we start at 7 and we're pretty comfortable with how this works. So just imagine right off the bat, just for showing up, you can miss 7 questions to get a 170. Then what we do is we look at the difficulty of each section and assess whether or not that'll loosen the scale, tighten the scale, or have no effect on the scale. For the international test, you start at -7. Your logic games is going to loosen the scale and take it to 8. Scholarships game is tough. Journalists, reporters at the end is no friend either.
Yeah.
When you go to the reading comprehension, which has got this bipedalism and Locke's value theory and the silkworms, that is also tough. That is going to loosen the scale from 8 to 9. That means you can miss 9 questions for 170. And no matter which logical reasoning you got, it is 0. That has no effect. And so it should have been that every international test taker had -9 for 170 as the scaling. And 170 just kind of come to represent the easiest way to talk about overall difficulty, meaning this is a reasonable test, a little bit on towards the harder side, but they give you a little bit of looseness in the scale. So hopefully that makes sense for all you international test takers. With that covered, since it's fairly easy to talk about 3-4 sections like that, let's get into the matrix for the domestic exams.
Yeah.
And here we've got 16, which is not bad, honestly. I'm like, 16, this is living. So much better than we had to see 54. So let's break it down. Again, we will start at missing 7 questions, so -7. Let's talk about that first logic games from February of 2018, the one with the seating, the lecture halls, the museum burglary, and the economics prerequisites. I sense that I shall receive some angry emails about this.
You might get a comment from me. Let's see how this goes.
This section, in my opinion, is difficult but reasonable, but not enough to move the scale at 170, but enough to move the scale at 160. And when we have that scenario where it affects test takers downscale, but test takers who are in the 170s, who are expected to be great, by the way, they're not affected by this. This is what we call the 0.5 outcome. So if you're shooting for 160, this does add a question to your scale. If you're shooting for 170, sorry, it does not.
Yeah, I'll go a little further than that. We don't always perfectly agree, which is part of the fun. I think this probably loosens the scale at a 165 as well. And that 0.5 at a 170, I might be more inclined to go 0.6, 0.7. I think this, of the logic game sections of the two that we saw for the domestic test this week, I think this was the harder of the two. So if one was going to move it a point at 170, this would be the one. And remember, I'll reiterate my disclaimer. We do tend to be conservative here.
Yeah. So given the choice between, adding nothing or loosening it one, we're going to tend towards not adding, because the more conservative approach allows people to get, the more accurate assessment of the worst case scenario. And we don't want anyone having a huge surprise. So in this case, I'm very comfortable with 0.5, which doesn't change it at 170, stays at -7, but it would change it at 160 or maybe 165. I can see the argument. Trust me, this took a while to arrive at. I don't know how comfortable I'm at with it.
We've both been back and forth on this one. Is it 0? Is it 1? It's definitely one lower. 170 is tougher to call. If you felt, again, in your experience as a 170 type of test taker, speaking to you, listener, that this was on the harder side of what you're typically used to, or maybe one of the toughest things you've seen, as I heard from a student this morning, then go ahead and move it the point for yourself. You're the better judge of that for your own experience than we could be.
Exactly. Now let's look at the other logic game section, and you might have already figured out
I spoiled it.
Sorry. Yeah, you gave it away. This is going to have no effect. This is the game about the truck loading bays and the zoning voting committee. We feel like this is a very straightforward section. I know that north-south-west truck game is a little bit odd, but I don't think it's as hard as the other one, and I don't think it stands out as like one of the hardest sections of all time. So if you had this section, your scale stays at -7 for a 170. I am sorry about that. I would love to be like, no, it adds 7 to the scale.
That's the second time through this podcast where I've pictured the audience kind of shudder or grimace. The first was when you referenced that Newton question.
Yeah.
I was like, I could feel the collective shudder for anybody.
I can feel the need, the kind of like kickback that's going to happen. I'm like, oh man, I'm just the messenger.
All the goodwill we built with the prediction shattered.
A lot of times people ask me afterwards, how do you guys come up with the predictions? Is it guessing? Is it just listening to students? It's a whole bunch of different things. And I think it's worth, mentioning this in the interim here. First off, we have a huge database, as probably is already apparent, about every test administration going back really into the 2000 point, where we just started taking notes. And every time I saw something on the test, I just kind of kept a note about it. And that has turned into something over the years that it has allowed us to see at times with incredible accuracy what's not just happening, but what may in fact happen down the line. And so as we look at this, I rely upon that quite a bit. You and I both are looking at it. We also do talk to students. We talk to instructors. We try to kind of like assess to make sure that nothing's changed. Maybe a game showed up in 2015. I want to make sure it's the same game in 2021. So we do that. And also there's experience. I mean, Jon, you and I collectively have been doing this for decades at this point.
Yeah.
I think we have a much better sense than someone who just started tutoring last year as to what overall test difficulty might really mean, as well as what LSAC's goals are with each test administration. But you add all that kind of experience and knowledge, and you marry it to a database that's unparalleled, you're all of a sudden able to make predictions that the prediction is always going to have a little bit of a guesstimation component to it, but it's going to be closer to truth and further away.
That's right. Yeah, the curtain that people are always trying to peek behind at LSAC for us is largely transparent in the first place. So we just look right through it. What I think
they just launched
really
a missile at us, by the way.
Oh, I know. I'm waiting to actually hear.
That might explode here in a few minutes, and it'll be due to Jon causing them to fire on us.
These guys come rappelling off the roof through the window.
Here come the ninjas.
Yeah, that's right. As I get a dart in the neck. What I was going to say is what's particularly interesting about that in this very moment is you and I are in the process of recording a course, literally teaching the LSAT collectively together, teamed up, which means we get to take all of the knowledge about exactly what's happening, the very prescient in-the-moment knowledge that we have about this stuff, which is objectively more than anyone else does. And we get to impart that in the way that we're actually presenting questions and concepts and really modify the way that we teach to the test as it exists, not just right now, but as it will exist for the near future as well. So this course has been a lot of fun to put together because we get to flavor it with this knowledge that no one else could possibly have.
Forewarned is forearmed.
That's right, my friend.
So again, starting off with the matrix at -7, in my opinion, both logic games don't have an effect, but the one with the museum burglary and the economics prerequisites could loosen the scale as you go down. What happens in reading comprehension? The first passage set was from February 2018. That's the one with Elaine Locke on it, okay, but also W.E.B. Du Bois, etc. Then beetle larvae in trees, lying, and copyright. This section was the harder of the two reading comps, in our opinion. This is going to loosen the scale by 1. Do I think this is the hardest reading comp of all time? No. Do I think it's hard enough to loosen the scale and move it? Yes.
Yeah.
So,
no argument from me.
All right. So then we go to the other section, which is what we kind of like shorthand calls the September 2017 experimental. This is the one about Vera Brittain, the pacifist after World War I, Inuits in Canada, the courts with the byproduct and enrichment, and then the Keystone Predators. This is a pretty reasonable section. I think it's easier than the other one. Not to say easy, easier. Again, it's relative. However, this is not going to move the scale, at least in my opinion. That's going to keep it wherever it was before, which for everybody should be 7.
Yeah, I don't see this one moving the scale either. In fact, I'm much more inclined to think that first logic game about the museum burglary is going to move the scale. If anything does, would move the scale more than this one about the Inuits and the
I agree.
Keystone Predators and stuff.
Yeah, to me, the truck loading game and then this passage about the pacifists and the Inuits, those two are not moving the scale. I'm absolutely certain about that.
Yeah,
I feel very comfortable with the RC that we're talking about here with like the lying and the copyright and the beetles and the trees, that moving it. And then that logic game section that you and I have talked about, I think it's more in the middle.
Yeah, that's the coin toss here so far.
All right. So let's go to logical reasoning. There were 4 sections to deal with, and sometimes it's really easy for us to be like, oh, they all had no effect or they all had the same effect. That is not the case here. Let's start off with the first section from February 2018. This was the section that had vitamin B6, folk medicine, rabies and vampires, foreshocks and earthquakes in it as well, and also wealth redistribution. This, I think, was a very reasonable section. I would say this has no effect on the scale. So
I would agree with you, and let's not overlook the fact that there were only 25 questions here as well. Sometimes that extra question is enough to buy you an extra point of a buffer. You don't get it with the 25.
Let's go to the other February 2018 section. This is one about E.T. the Extraterrestrial, the movie. Old movie, really. It's like 1982 or something like that. Brown bats, Japanese bells, employee, email spies. There could be some debate here because for me, first off, this isn't going to loosen the scale. At best, the scale stays where it is. I think for scores in the 170s, it might actually take a point away. And for scores in the 160s, it doesn't. So kind of like a negative 0.5. And I don't know that anybody's like jumping up and down to hear that, but that's kind of like what my assessment is that this may have been the easiest, again, not easy, but easiest relative, speaking of all 4 of the sections that we're talking about. I can leave it at 0, though. This is where I'm like, if you did that section, you're like, it was pretty easy. Take 1 away. Tighten the scale by 1.
Yeah, especially if you're in the 170s, mid to upper 170s in particular. I think this might have actually cost you a question.
Yeah, this is another 25 questions section. And remember, if you're scoring in the 170s, you're supposed to be good. You're not supposed to miss questions, and it's tough. LR is always tough because it's just such a, kind of like a constant symphony where you're just one thing after another. But I feel like this probably is going to tighten that scale a little bit. But if you're looking at 160 or 150, then it's not having that same effect. It does have tough questions in it. There's no doubt about that. Let's move on. Let's go to the next section, which was kind of like a new conglomerate section. This is one about African elephants, grapefruit, the one about Newton and criticism. This one is going to actually loosen the scale, which you don't always see in logical reasoning. This is a tough section as far as I can tell.
Yeah, I agree.
When you've got one of the questions basically being like, what role does this play? And everybody's complaining about it, you know that it's not going to be an easy section. And so this is going to loosen the scale for those of you who had this section. And then last, we've got the crazed glass section. I really, John, want to start a band called Crazed Glass now because I think that's a cool name. It's also got Chinese dinosaurs. Milk is bad for humans. Questions on this came in some part from December of 2017 experimental. This has no effect on your scale. So
there you go. Yeah.
We'll do the fast one, logic games. If you had the museum or economics, you start at -7. It, to me, has no effect. John might argue for it actually giving you some, loosening by 1.
Well, that's mostly because I'm just a sucker for public gratitude. So I'm going to say -8. Send me all the thank yous if you're listening.
This is supposed to be the fast recap section.
Oh, sorry. So don't interrupt. Got it.
Yeah, why are we having this conversation? We already know how you feel about
all
it.
right, go ahead.
If you had the truck loading bays and the zoning voting committees, no effect on your logic game. So start at 7 and then figure it out from there. On RC, you're either going to add 1 if you had that line, copyright, beetle, larva, Elaine Locke passage, or you're not going to add anything if you had the Vera Brittain pacifist, Inuits, Keystone Predators. And then for logical reasoning, if you had the vitamin B6 and the rabies vampires and the earthquakes, no effect. If you had crazed glass, Chinese dinosaurs, milk's bad for humans, no effect. If you had E.T. the movie, brown bats, Japanese bells, email spies, that's probably no effect or maybe tightening it by 1. I think tightening it by 1. And then last, if you had the Newton section with grapefruit and African elephants and hyenas, that loosens it by 1. And so you're starting at 7 and you're adding or taking away or having no effect. And that gives us a fairly interesting range from like 6 to 9, possibly, depending upon how you interpret some of that.
Yeah, I'd be surprised if it was 6 with any but maybe a single combination of things. The easier games, the easier reading, and just that one section with E.T. and the brown bats and Japanese bells. That might do 6. I'd be surprised if it got to 10. Very surprised if it got to 10.
Yeah, there's a way. That's part of, I think, some of our hesitation, at least part of mine, especially with the logic games, is like, I don't think that any test combination here is 10. And that's one of the reasons why I'm like, I can see some of the 0.5s here. -9 to me is the loosest scale that we're going to see.
Yeah.
So once we reach that particular point, the way I conceive of this, -9 is actually what it is. The way you looked at it, you want to argue a little bit more for the glory of 10. But it's not 10. None of these tests were -10 on
I don't
170.
think so. Yeah. To me, the most comfortable -9 still doesn't go to 10, but would be the game section with the burglaries, the museum burglaries, and the econ prerequisites. The reading passage set with the lying and the copyright and the Beatles with the trees, Elaine Locke. And then finally, the logical reasoning with the African elephants, the grapefruit, and good old Emilie du Châtelet, I believe is her name, criticizing Isaac Newton.
She deserves more credit historically. But that wraps up the discussion of the matrices that we have there. My apologies for our verbosity today. I think we're both kind of like elated the way things turned out. Probably over-congratulated each other too much. But you know what? We don't do that often, so sorry. This test, the scores come out on Thursday, July 1st at 9 a.m. Eastern. The next LSAT that's coming up in August, let's be honest about it, that is also going to be a very new and different type of event because you're going to have experimentals. I'm going to say right now in advance that we're going to do that crystal ball and we're going to make some specific predictions. I already know that. However, when the actual test happens, this type of recap is going to be much more challenging and maybe impossible because a quarter of all the questions won't count. And it'll be virtually impossible to figure that out in some instances, if not many, if all instances. So just be aware of this. This might be the closest thing that we see to an actual prediction for a while. We'll have to see how August goes, but I'm not really sure we'll be able to do this in August because the experimental section is going to make it a challenge. And we'll talk a little bit more about that when we get closer to that particular test. So hopefully this is something that was good news for you if you were listening. I apologize again for the length and our general craziness today.
I apologize for nothing. I'm excited about your anniversary, man. That's all this is.
Not as excited as I am because it's now time to go party.
There you go. More champagne for you. Well deserved.
Thank you very much. If you get a chance, please subscribe to this podcast on iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, or anywhere else you may find it in the wide world. And if you've enjoyed it, please leave us a comment and rating as well. Only 5 stars is acceptable on my anniversary. And if you have any questions, please send those to lsatpodcast@powerscore.com. We do mailbag episodes regularly, and I know one is coming relatively soon. We'd be happy to answer your questions for you. On behalf of Jon and myself, we hope the LSAT went well. We hope that you are safe and sound, and we will talk to you next week.